Okay, and welcome to week 12 of this wonderful graphics course. And today we are going to talk about a rather special subject, and this has to do with the last possible object you can do. And this is the virtual reality object. And the reason why I'm making this an option is because I honestly believe it is an incredible resource and something that we really need to at least look at. And also, you would be just doggone amazed at how easy it could potentially be to do if you want to do something special. And so let's first of all go ahead and talk about what we're going to be doing. Okay, virtual reality object workflow, because that's what it is. I say brace yourselves because you're not going to believe this. I mean, this is really incredible, and I honestly think that it could lead to a whole new world that you haven't even seen before. Okay, so the review of the workflows. We do this once again all the time just to make sure that everybody understands. We've got the 3D printer workflow. We've got the animated logo workflow. We've got the print object workflow. And we've got the multimedia object workflow. And today we're talking about the virtual reality workflow. Now, if you count those are 5 possible objects. You only have to do 4, meaning that you don't actually have to attempt a virtual reality object. Or if you happen to like the TV animation, you could do 2 of those as part of your 4 workflows. But I'm hoping that you'll decide to at least try some of these. Don't just do all the same one or half and half. Try to stretch yourself a little bit, because a lot of these things are surprisingly easy in themselves, but they involve different skills. Okay, so once again, the 3D printer workflow. That's basically when you take the modeler program, make a 3D object of a single layer, send it out as an STL file, do a file export as STL. Then you go into the MakerBot desktop program, do your final sizing, do the preview, and then print it. And as of this week, the workstation in the corner in the radio area, which is attached to the 3D printer, is now completely up and running. The reason I say that is because if you are working in that workstation, you can run this last step there, and you can actually have the computer do it. You don't need a thumb drive or anything like that. It's already connected. And so basically you can print right from the program. Okay, the print logo workflow. Basically you've got your 3D modeler making your 3D object. You've got your layout program where you arrange the objects, lights, cameras, no animation as usual. Export is a single frame, no animation, high resolution. Then you take that into Photoshop, possibly if you need to do some tweaking, but ultimately it goes to InDesign, where you create a paper layout where you would see your dummy sheet, which got a little piece of paper there, and decide where you want to put your design elements. Then that goes to a PDF, which then goes to be printed on paper. Or you can take it down to Office Depot or Office Max, whatever they're calling it these days, and print it on whatever you want. You can also print it on just about anything else that you can imagine, depending on what you can access online. A TV logo workflow, that's where you got your 3D modeler, making your 3D objects in the modeler program. You run them in a layout, arrange the objects, lights, cameras, and animation, and export as a series of PNG still frames, which could be 32-bit if you want the background to be blacked out or removed so that you can put it over something else, or 24-bit if your background is important. Okay, then Adobe Premiere accepts the frames. Then you've got basically the ability to treat that as a movie clip, and then you can export your final product, including any tweaks you want to make, as an H.264.mp4 file. And all of the instructions on that are in previous lectures. Now the multimedia object workflow is kind of similar. Starts again with the modeler program, 3D objects, layout program, arranging everything, including an animation, even though it could be a very short animation. And then again, you're exporting as PNG frames. And here you go into Dreamweaver or Adobe Animate or some other program where you're going to create a kind of animation that would work in multimedia. And of course, the final product, as we said before, could be a multimedia file, compiled, or program element of some kind. Now, the virtual reality object workflow, this is where it's amazingly simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. First of all, once again, as usual, you're in Modeler, but here you're creating more than just an object. You're creating an environment. Most likely that's what you're going to do. Meaning that if you remember the layout program is your studio, but it has no environment inherent in it. Meaning that if you're going to a regular television studio, and let's say it's a sound stage for a movie, if you know what a sound stage is, basically a big empty room. So you walk in there, and maybe there are cameras already in place, maybe there's a white background or something, but there's literally nothing there. You got your lighting on top, but the actual space is empty. So if you're talking about layout is like a big empty studio that doesn't even have a floor. Meaning that you've got literally 3D space going on forever and a camera hanging out in thin air and one light. You can add more lights and whatever it is you want to do. But the point is that you're starting with nothing. And so any environment that you want to create, including the illusion of a floor, ceiling, walls, or anything like that, that all gets created in the Modeler program. And you can have multiple layers doing this. In fact, we will in fact do that, having multiple layers. And so you're creating the entire thing in Modeler, the entire virtual reality environment. That doesn't mean that it can't include animation that you create later. So from the layout program, you arrange the objects, lights, cameras, and any animation you're going to do. And ultimately, yes, you will export that out as still frames. It's just going to be slightly different than you did before. And then once again, because in this case you're making a wraparound image, it's going to be an unusual file format. And you're going to take that either into Photoshop if you're doing a still image with no animation, or you can do it in Premiere. Either way, you're going to get basically the same idea, and that is what's exported as a final movie. And that you can view using a VR headset of some kind, something perhaps like this. And so, yeah, you can actually view this. And so the idea is when you put this on, you can then look around anywhere you want, and you can see your design elements. And so that is a virtual reality world that you are creating. And if you don't have the benefit of owning one of those things or having access to one, you can just play it as a regular video in the VLC Media Player, and then you can navigate around using your mouse. And once you try that, you can see how easy it actually is, and we'll be demonstrating that today. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit because I do think it's important that we put this in context, and this is my only opportunity to do so. And so virtual reality, we've already talked about some of these things before, so I won't take a whole lot of time on them. What is virtual? Virtual is there, but not there really, not really there. And so we've already talked about virtual reality in that sense. It has no physical substance. Most of what you do on the computer involves manipulating things that simply don't exist. And it's made purely for information, but in an informational-based environment, purely of information. And so the environment actually basically contains the rules of itself. It's not real, but it behaves as if it is. And so, for example, you can have gravity, you can have the speed of light, all those physical laws. And if you cause something to happen in that environment, it will behave as if it's real, potentially. And so we're going to talk more about simulated forces as we go along. Okay, capable of yielding measurable results. And so this actually has some interesting applications. The basically crime scene investigators do these sorts of things, where they would be able to investigate crime scenes by recreating them. Okay, virtual universes. The computer creates a virtual universe in RAM. We talked about this way back in the beginning of the semester. Your computer RAM is essentially a scratch pad, a playground. And in the context of this program, the programs we use, it actually does create a three-dimensional space that it thinks is real and that you can manipulate and build as you go along. All files, movies, sounds, spreadsheets don't exist until we make their results exist. And so in this particular case, they still don't exist. If you're looking at something on a virtual reality device, that doesn't mean it exists, but you can experience it as if it does. A print object exists when you print it out, of course. A 3D printed object exists when it's printed out. But for a large extent, what we think of as media is always a kind of illusion. Okay, some virtual universes are more obvious than others, and this is as old as video games. I'm old enough to remember running across to a place called Fun and Games, running across the street with a handful of quarters to play my favorite video games, which were, in fact, virtual reality universes. So if you're playing Donkey Kong, it's not a very complicated universe, but you can still jump over the barrels and grab the sledgehammer and stuff like that. That's a kind of universe. Okay, virtual universes can be based on one, but the rules can be different. Anyone who's played some of these Mario Brothers things where you put the little beanie propeller on your head and fly around, yeah, that wouldn't exist in our universe, but once you figure out that you can do it there, more power to you. Okay, virtual viewing. It can be as simple as the computer screen. In fact, most of the time it is. Most video games were always played on a two-dimensional computer screen, but can include head-mounted displays. And I will say, as an aside, that this took an awfully long time to get here. And so let me explain. Back in the 1980s, believe it or not, the 1980s, most of you were nowhere near born. In the 1980s, I went to a convention called SIGGRAPH, and I saw demonstrated a virtual reality helmet, which looked like a gigantic helmet. You know, it was a really, really ugly thing. You put on your head, and you had a programming glove, and you could look around and see a virtual universe. And I said, wow, this is going to change the world. It didn't. Then, in 1993, I was in the Netherlands. I was in Europe. And I went to, I believe it was Rotterdam, to see another convention. They had exactly the same setup. You know, this was about 5 to 7 years later. Same helmet, everything. I put it on, and I said, wow, this is going to be something. It wasn't. You know, then, fast forward ahead to around 2000, 2003, let's say, at Methodist University, they had the environmental simulator, where they had basically the same setup. And I said, wow, this is going to be in everyone's house within 5 years. Well, guess what? It's not going to happen that quickly. It took something else to make it happen. And we'll get into exactly how that is later, but you can have the potential for programming gloves, tactile feedback, all kinds of possible things, simulation rooms and environments, all these things. Heads-up displays for augmented reality. So this is the tip of a very big iceberg, most of which we won't really have time to get into. Reality versus non-reality. Computer-based realities are fiction and can created completely through mass-based elements. Surfaces, ray tracing, everything we've talked about creates a fiction, but it looks real. Virtual tours can be based on spherical photography that captures an experience for the audience, which is a little bit different, but not much. That's where we intersect. Augmented reality provides a mixture of the real and the not real, kind of like when the Terminator's walking around, looks around and sees digital displays telling him everything he's looking at, that sort of thing. Okay, virtual reality varieties. Now this is where it's kind of important. First, we have what is called stereoscopic video, which is kind of a hallmark for virtual reality. And this is a situation where you put on the headset and you're looking at an image that appears to have more depth. We also have what's called 360 video, which is really what we're going to be talking about today, because this is the heart of what I believe virtual reality is and will become, where you can see not just what's in front of you, but what's behind you as well. It creates the illusion of a sphere. And full immersion video, which would be something where you can actually walk around and touch things, move things, and stuff like that. That's a little more difficult. It requires more of an environment, but that's not to say that it is not possible. Now, the roots of VR, which I think are important to explain. First of all, we had training simulations, and you can see here, particularly the image on the right, I actually saw this. This is what I was just describing. This was that incredibly ugly helmet with the programming glove, and that's what virtual reality looked like. Now, most people are not going to have one of these in their home. Nobody would sit and stare into something like that. I mean, that looks barbaric. It was cumbersome and costly, meaning that the helmet alone might cost $1,000. And so if you actually wanted to try to do this, suddenly you needed like 3 computers chained together, and there's only so much you could do. And you needed specialized equipment that was very hard to come by if you want to do flight simulators that really have flight seats and controls. That's a little bit more difficult, or at least it was, than most people would be able to do. And if you set it up, are you going to do that all day long? Chances are no, it's just going to get in the way. And so all of these were reasons why this wasn't going to happen right away. Now, the necessary components for virtual reality. First of all, you need a binocular viewer. Almost all virtual reality setups involve a screen for each eye to give you that stereographic effect, or even if it's not 3D in essence, to basically take over your senses. And so you're putting something on over both of your eyes. Some sort of sensors to figure out how you're oriented, meaning that if you're looking over here, the computer's got to know that you're looking over there, and then it's got to adjust your view accordingly. And it has to know your position. So if you're moving around the room, if you've got something like full immersion, it's got to be able to keep track of that, which is a necessary component. So why weren't we doing this before? The same question I asked before. Because the technology was not ready. And honestly, that's the God's honest truth. It wasn't ready. In fact, a lot of technology that we take for granted today had some kind of a debut where it didn't work. Even something as simple as the mouse. The computer mouse was around in the 50s, but nobody used it because they were still working with the older technology with the typing codes and basically nothing else. And so a lot of this, sometimes you got to be there at the right time, and you don't always know when the right time is going to be. Okay, the market wasn't there because when something first appears, it's usually frightfully expensive, and people just aren't capable of spending the money on it. And so they may simply not have the backing of the masses. You see, when something becomes available for everybody, then suddenly it gets cheaper. Now, 2 missing links had to be created from the demonstrations I was pointing out earlier. First, cell phone technology. Now, you may think that has absolutely nothing to do with this, but it really does. If it weren't for this, we would not have a platform for virtual reality, in my opinion. Or at least, if not this specifically, the technology that went into this. And non-traditional video. And we'll explain what traditional video is to fully understand that, but video had to change radically to make this possible. Okay, so let's start out with a smartphone, the whole idea of the cell phone. It's an incredibly high-resolution screen. So this is where it gets interesting, where somebody would tell you this screen is 4K. And so the first question anybody who's worked in the video industry might ask is, why in the heck do I need a 4K screen that's 2 inches across? Because the pixels are going to be so small that it doesn't really make a difference how many there are. So the difference between 1080 and 4K on this screen is not going to be very easy to see. It will when you get to a larger screen, but not on this. But if you take a magnifying glass to it, then you've got something. Okay, GPS tracking. We have to know where you are in the room, and this can actually do that using GPS. And level orientation sensors, things like that. So it knows if you're looking up, looking down, looking here, looking that way. And so it does that so that you got your GPS working, and so when it knows when it's upside down, right side up, and things like that. That's part of the modern smartphone. Okay, non-traditional video. This is what your television set used to look like, and it's actually quite possible that none of you have ever seen one. Or if you have, you'd say, what the heck is that monstrosity? So the original television was based on a vacuum tube, which was very large and very heavy. Actually, some of them were small but very heavy. And so a television set was a cumbersome device that needed a great deal of energy to operate, and it was very simple. very simple in many ways. And so today's version of the television is not in any way encumbered by that. You basically have these paper-thin screens that can be any size and shape. So the original television set, you try to turn that upside down, it's not going to work properly, believe it or not. And try to put it on its side, it wasn't designed to operate that way, so it won't. And so modern technology is nothing like that. It's based on the LCD screen and eventually the LED screen. And so these are very, very different. Okay, so if you look at stereographic video or side-by-side video, SBS video, I just wanted to make the point that the principle is very old. If you look at this image here, this is called a stereopticon. This technology existed in the 1800s, where you would have a stereo camera that would take two images of basically the same view, but from a slightly different point of view. And then you put on the stereopticon device, and it gives the illusion of depth. Some of you will know this as the Viewmaster toy, which I played with when I was a kid, and most people have seen. Even survives even today. You still see these around. And the 3D movie down here, which every once in a while makes a comeback. They're not very good, but they make a comeback anyway. And then we get to something like Google Chrome, or not Chrome, but Google Cardboard, where you would have the ability to get a very cheap version of this thing where you could put your cell phone in. Once again, the cell phone is critical. You can magnify that, and so you have the ability to do that. And of course, you've got something like the Oculus system, which is a surprisingly inexpensive but very good version of this. And so this is where it's headed. Two images side by side, right and left point of view, and it simulates depth perception. So if you're a pirate and you have only one eye and you got the eye patch on, sorry, it won't work. So with one eye, you only can see one point of view. The reason we have two eyes is so that we can judge distance better. And so therefore, that's what the stereographic video is all about. And how we do that, two cameras mounted side by side. I actually made one of these things. I don't recommend it. It's very difficult. With the GoPro cameras, it's a lot easier, but I'm not going to get into that. And so you create two separate video images that you can display side by side, and you edit them together in your Premiere program. So you're creating a video that has left and right, which you then play on your screen. Now the 360 video, that's a different thing altogether. The thing to understand here is that you're literally taking images going in all directions at the same time. So if you look at this image down here, these are cameras on a cube that are pointing in all 6 directions. And so these are the GoPro cameras, and we actually have a rig like this where you can take pictures in all 6 directions, and then there is software that will figure out where one point of view ends and the other begins, and it will map that image onto the inside of a spherical shape. And so then, if you're inside that shape, you have the illusion of being able to look around in all directions. And all I'm doing is suggesting that we do the same thing using the Lightwave program. And so the one thing I'll say about that at this point is that originally I tried to simulate the effect of 6 cameras looking off in different directions, and the same software that would allow me to stitch that. And yes, it worked, but it wasn't necessary, because in the layout program, you could create a camera that just sees in all directions. So what's the difference? And so that's what I'm going to ask you to think about. Okay, so what can you do with virtual reality? Well, you can create your own game environment. You can make an experimental video. So you can have weird stuff happening, so you can look around and see it from behind. You can do things like that. You can do a virtual tour of something. You can create your own haunted house experience. You can do a presentation, which involves asking your audience to look up and see this information, look to the right and see that information, and so forth. And you can design your own concept house as another possibility. Or you can curate your portfolio. So these are all some examples of what you can do with this technology. Okay, so once again, we're going to start our journey here in the modeler program. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick peek at the layout program over here. So if I'm looking in layout, once again, you can see that there's your camera. Camera looks straight ahead, and if you look around, you'll see that you have a basically empty universe. You've got infinite space up and down. Basically, you can go anywhere. And so we're going to pretend that that camera is your audience. Your audience will see from that camera, and they get to decide where they look. So that's the first thing to understand. So now we're going to give them something to look at. So the first thing we want to do is to create, believe it or not, some limits. So you could have a basically unlimited environment if you're doing traveling in space, but let's not go there. Let's do it simple. So what we want to do is we want to create a room. Let's just start with that. Let's create a room for our audience. And so to do that, all I'm going to do is to create a box. And so there's the top of the box. We're looking down. And it can be as simple as that. That can be the room. Now let's go back a bit. We want to make this room a little larger. So we can even make it very large. So right now, that's the layout. It's a rectangular room, and we are going to give it some height. So let's say we want to have it a nice tall room. And so if we're looking at it from the outside, maybe not that tall. Let's bring the height down a little bit. So this is going to be our room. And so we are going to put our audience inside there. Now, since it's kind of a brick shape, let's be a little bit more generous and let's give it a little bit more. Let's make it more square. So that looks a little better. This is kind of like the shape of a classroom or something like that. Now, here's where we depart from everything we've done before, in that we're not going to be looking at this room from the outside. We literally want to be inside the room. And so let's get that established first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this object, and I'm basically going to call this demo underscore space. So this is my demo space. And so then I'm going to go immediately to Lightwave because I find it easier to work this way. And I'm just going to load that object. And demo space, there it is, and there it is. Okay, so here is the first thing that we have to do. We are now looking at the room from the outside. So if I go to my camera view, I will see there is my object. So I'm going to go to camera and I'm going to walk towards the object. Eventually, the object disappears. So if I were to go back to perspective view, I can see that the camera has crossed the threshold of that object. So I'm going to move the camera inside the object to roughly the center of the object. And I can see that now the camera is within the object. I'm going to back it up because I know that the lens of the camera is basically what we're talking about. And so then, if I were to quickly go back to my camera view, I see nothing at all. Now, first question I would ask is, why do I see nothing at all? There's a very simple answer, and that is that this is an object that is one-sided. So, if I were to tell the object that I want the walls to be in reverse so that everything is inside, the box would have an inside but not an outside. Now, in this case, let's make it a little more realistic here. So I'm going to create some surfaces. So here I am within the box. The box is there. And I am going to put myself in polygon mode. And if I grab that front surface, just the front, and which actually could be the back. So I'm going to give that surface a name. I'm going to go to change surface, and I'm going to call that, let's call it back, because from inside the room that would probably be the back. So I'm going to call it back wall. Just back is fine. And so then I can then grab this one, change surface. I'm going to call that one front. And then of course that one, change surface. That would be left. And then I got this one, change surface. That would be right. And there's only 2 more to go. So if I'm down here, change surface, that would be the floor. And finally, up here, change surface, that would be the ceiling. So now my room has some dimensions. I'm going to save this object. I'll save object. So if I'm over here and I go back to camera view, again I see nothing because all of those surfaces are facing away from me. So if I then go into Surface Editor, those are my surfaces. And let's say I go immediately to the front wall, and all I'm going to do is make that double-sided. Immediately the front wall appears. And so we can then put anything on that front wall. So let's right now keep it simple. And I'm going to say that the front wall is going to be kind of like a robin's egg blue. And so then my left wall, I'm also going to make that double-sided. And I'm going to make my left wall kind of a green color. And let's see if we can figure out where that is. Go to perspective view. And if I'm on my cameras, and if I go to my rotate, you can see there is my left wall, which is green, and the right wall does not yet exist. So then if I go to my surface editor, the right wall, we can make that wall kind of a reddish color and make it double-sided. And so then if I'm looking at my camera and I'm rotating, now there we may have a problem. I can show you we can temporarily fix that by giving it some illumination. Right now there's no lighting in here, or there's not much lighting, but we're just going to give it some illumination just so that we can see that it's there. And so we can also turn all the way around and see the back wall. So the back wall will also make double-sided, and we'll make that one kind of a, let's give that a purple look, and we'll give it some illumination so that we can see that it exists. And so once again, if we're looking at this, we now have all the walls of our room. And so if we look up at our ceiling, I'm going to make that double-sided. Now the ceiling, I'm going to make white. So if we're looking up at that, so we have a white ceiling, but I'm also going to make that semi-transparent because I want to be able to see through that into the room. Now the floor, temporarily, let's decide that the floor will be yellow and double-sided. So I can look down at the floor. So now suddenly I've got my bearings. There is my room. And so it's very important that we understand how that works. We've got a room, and that's right now where we're going to leave this. I'm going to save the scene. I'm going to call it room underscore. I'm going to call it demo room or demo space underscore scene. Then we're going to go back here. Go back here to Modeler, and notice that Modeler remembered all this stuff. And so now our room has all those characteristics. So now we get to do all kinds of crazy things. So first of all, let's put something in the room. So if I go to one layer out and put this in the back, I go to one layer out and I put this in the background, there is my room. I am going to put a ball in this corner of the room. So in that corner of the room, there is going to be a globe for no particular reason. And so I can also, on that same layer, in this particular case, we don't have to make all kinds of crazy layers. We can put a box on this corner of the room. To make it a tall box, let's pretend that's a refrigerator. And let's also pretend over here, let's put a cone shape here. And the cone shape will be back here. And one more, let's put a toroid right now. The toroid's in the center. So we'll size it up a little bit. I don't really like toroids, but we'll do that. So make the toroid bigger. So now the toroid is, just move that around a bit. So I'm going to turn that on its side. That'll be like a tire. So I'm going to rotate that. I'm going to rotate, oh, wrong way. I'm going to rotate it so that it's like that, let's say. And I'll do that close to 90 degrees. And that's almost right, but I'm also going to rotate it this way so that I want to have that sort of against the wall. Because this is largely for demonstration. We don't need to do a lot with this. But that's going to be our room. And I'm going to save that. Save object. And so it's all on 2 layers now. But if I go over to here, let's see what happens. I got my camera. It's still set to rotate. And there are these objects. Now we see that they are in the room. Now we don't have to do much with these objects, but we can do some. So, for example, that object there, let's just keep it simple for today. And go back here real quick, and I'm going to turn off move. And I'm going to give that one a surface. Change surface. I'm going to call that sphere. And I could make that a globe. I could do all kinds of things with that. And this one, change surface. I can call that cone. And this one, could also give that multiple surfaces. Change surface. You can call that box. And this one, change surface. You can call that toroid. So again, save the object. Now if I go back here, you can see that the objects now have different surfaces. And I kind of like what's going on with the lighting, only because we don't really have to do a lot with the lighting, but we can. So why don't we do one thing? We'll go out of here for a second into perspective view, and I'm just going to add a light. Now notice, one of the reasons I wanted that ceiling to be semi-transparent, I want to be able to look down into this thing and be able to see what's going on. And so this can be helpful. So I'm going to go to items, and I'm going to create a light. And I'm going to create a point light. So this will be, just call it light. And so that will illuminate the entire room. So if I go back to camera view, now suddenly, oh, I'm moving the light. So I'm going to keep the light about here. We'll even bring it up a little bit. So if I go back to camera view, and so under modify, I'm going to go to rotate. And so I can now see that there's light and shadow on all of these objects. And there we are. And so I could have a field day with this, but right now we're going to start with this. So I'm just going to go to my surface editor, and I'm going to go to my, my cone, and I can make that purple. I'm going to add some smoothing to it. And let's see how good that looks. A little better, not by much, but at least it took some of the edge off it. Now the sphere. So basically if I find the sphere, I can smooth that out a little bit, and I can make that kind of a green sphere, and I can add some specularity, some glossiness, and some reflection. How about? That would be really cool. And I could even add some transparency and double siding, which will give that effect. Let's see what happens if I switch to VPR. See, now the sphere is acting like a lens. So then if I move over and look back at that, and go back to the cone, I want the cone to be a little shinier too, not that it has to be. I could make that reflective, but not this time. So I'll make it a little glossy, but that's good enough. Okay, so then we keep looking around. Now we got the toroid. We can have a lot of fun with the toroid. So if I go to the toroid, what can I do with the toroid? What color is that going to be? I can make that, say, mint green. Make it smooth. We're getting somewhere. That one we can make reflective. That could be a really weird type of thing, or reflective type thing. Give it some specularity, so it has some substance. And lastly, what else we got? We got the refrigerator. All right, well, the refrigerator, that will be the box. I'm going to make that a dark color, like a dark red or something like that. But I'm going to give it some specularity and maybe a little bit of reflection, so it's kind of like a dark marble or something like that. And that's probably enough. So if I'm looking at this, I've got a really weird situation. And so, believe it or not, we don't have to go any further. Now you notice there's a big shadow here from where that light is. So there's lots of stuff going on. But right now, we at least can agree that we've got a world to look at. And so that right now is virtual reality. And so right now, we can decide what the user is going to see. Wherever I point this camera, I can take a picture, and that's what the users see. What I want to do is I want to make the user able to decide what they want to see and when. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look straight ahead. Not that we really have to do this, but I'm going to just look ahead at the blue wall. And so that's what I know is straight ahead of me. I'm going to save this. And then I want to look at that camera. So right now the camera is there, and this is what I was telling you about. We could have gone through all the trouble of setting up a camera rig with 6 cameras that look off in different directions. I guarantee you that that would not have worked. Or it would have worked, but it would have taken a hell of a lot longer than this. So I'm just going to go to Properties. And so we're going to combine this to one step. I go to Camera Properties. So we're looking at the camera. And so at this point, I'm going to go to, instead of perspective camera, right now there's only one camera, it's called camera. Perspective camera, I'm going to go to advanced camera. Advanced camera. And so then we get this other dialog box. And so the item is camera, right? That's all. It doesn't have a name right now. We're not really going to give it one. And so I'm going to go down here to field of view. Field of view. And so in this area, I'm going to do only 2 adjustments. Right now, the perspective is 45 degrees, about 45.24 degrees. And I'm going to change this to a cylinder. Because we tempted to use a sphere, but a sphere doesn't really work as easily. So I'm going to take a cylinder and just do it twice. So right now, I'm going to tell this that I want to see 360 degrees cylindrical. And I don't have to do it here. It says same as horizontal. So now, if I'm done with the camera, you see what happens. The camera now sees in all directions, which is physically impossible. But it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter. That's the way it works. Okay, so here we are in our virtual scene, and I want to do one thing, just for the heck of it. And we're just going to add a little bit of animation here. So if I go back to perspective, so now I'm looking at this place in perspective view, and I'm going to turn off virtual progressive render, and let's see what I'm able to get away with. Am I able to grab any of these? Now, because I've created all of those objects in another layer, they're all one thing, so they're part of the background. So that's one little problem I've got. But I'm going to go around that by introducing another object. And so if I go to File, Load, let's see what I can find. I'm going to load the logo that we made, the in-focus logo. So the in-focus logo is loaded. So if I go to Modify, Move, let's see if we can find it. There it is. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to make it a lot bigger. So there's my in-focus logo, which you can see there. Then I'm going to move it around. And I'm going to put it just inside there. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to allow that to exist on frame 1. Then I'm going to give it 1 second to do something. So I'm at 30 frames. So I'm going to have it go over here, and I'm going to have it rotate 180 degrees. So within 1 second, it's going to do that. So at the 2 second point, I'm going to move it over to here, and I'm going to have it rotate to match the wall. Doesn't have to be perfect. And I can move it to the wall. So it's going to do something like this. So notice it leaves the room for a second. So I'm going to nip that in the bud so I can make sure it never leaves the room. So maybe leaves the room for a second. That's okay. And then we'll have it at 80 frames or close. I'm going to bring it down here to where the cone is. And I'm going to rotate that again. And I'm going to move that over here like that. So let's see what that does. Close. All right, that's fine. And then we're going to take it down to here. And we're going to bring it over here and rotate it once again. And I'm going to move it to this wall. So that's kind of cool. And we'll take it back to the end. And at the end, we will put it roughly where it was. So like that. So remember, we're looking at this from above. So it's going to have 120 frames to basically do that stuff. So if we were looking at this, let's put this into camera view. And now camera view is giving us kind of a fake version of that. But it works because we're looking forward now. Notice how it leaves our sight. Now this is important. If the moment I go to VPR, it's showing me what it's actually going to render. Watch this. You see, it goes to the next wall, which is really right next door, but the back of the wall is there. Notice how it leaves there and then comes back to the other side of the purple wall, which is, we're seeing the back of the wall in two different places because we're now looking at it from a completely different point of view. So this is crazy, but it works. And so we're almost done here. We're going to go ahead and render this. So if I were to go to render, now here's where there's one little caveat that we got to do. I've got to go to render globals. Now when I'm looking at cameras, I can't go with 640 by 480 because that's not going to work. Now the camera characteristics are important because this is set. We need to make them 3840 by 1920. 3840 by 1920, which is somewhere in between high definition and 4K. So for our width, 3840. And for our height, 1920. And once we've got that, it will render it correctly. And so if we go back to general, you see we got 120 frames, and we're just going to go over to output. And so I'm going to save RGB. So in this case, I'm going to put this in a special folder, and I'm going to create a subfolder within there, which I'm going to call frames. And within there, I'm going to write VR demo. And I'm going to hit save. And then basically all I've got to do is hit the F10 button. And I never know what to do with that. And so it's going to go ahead and start rendering this out. Okay, and now we are finished with the rendering. And naturally I chose not to bore you with the details of that. That was about a 20-minute render. So I'm just going to close this out. And now we're going to move on to Premiere. So here in Premiere, I'm going to make a new project. And I'm going to call this VR demo. And we'll call this finalized. And I'm going to put this with the frames. And there we are. Okay, so now when we open this up, we see that we get the usual extremely ugly Premiere window with nothing in anything. So once again, here's our timeline window. This would be our picture window. This would be our scopes. And this is our project window. So we basically just have to import those frames, and that's almost all we got to do. So if I do File, Import, and I go into the Frames folder, then we see we have all of those frames. So I grab one of these, and I just make sure that image sequence is checked. If I didn't check image sequence, it would only grab that one frame. So I want to check all of the, I want to take all of the frames all the way down to frame 120. And so there it is. It's taken very little time for it to do that because at this point this is no longer 3D graphics, this is just still images. So I drag that into the timeline and I get this. Now you see it's a very small section because this is a very short animation. So if I scrunch that up there, I can see Now this is our impossible window because we're looking at 360 degrees. And so, as I move along there, looks like I scrunched it up too much, but you can see what it's supposed to do. So what we want to do is we want to render that as a video and then see what we can do with it. So I'm just going to go in here and do File, Export. We're not really doing anything else with this. We're just exporting it as media. And when I do that, I immediately get this. And we get H.264, which is the MPEG format. And we're going to export this. I'm just going to put this right here as VR_final demo. That's demo. And then I'm just going to say export. I'm not even going to bother queuing it. And you'll see that it doesn't take long to do this because all it's doing is making a very short video. And there it is. So if I were to go and I see final demo, notice there was one that didn't work. I tested it in between lectures here. If I were to right-hand click on this, well, first of all, if I just double-click on it, what happens? It would open up in Media Player. Now, looking at it in Media Player, I think you can see that as interesting as that is, it doesn't really help us. On the other hand, if I right-hand click and I open with VLC Media Player, VLC is a little bit smarter. VLC gives you this. Now it's going to play in a loop. Now watch this. I got my mouse here. I'm going to look over to the right and I can follow that. You can see how that works? I can keep turning my head and follow the animation. I can also look up. I can look down and all around. And so this is what the user can experience because I'm starting out looking at the white wall, but I can look over at the green wall. I can look at that. And I get roughly the same point of view as a person in an audience. And so that is the idea. And so I want you to think about what you can do with that. And so seriously, folks, virtual reality has a future. It has incredible potential. One way or another, it's going to be somewhere. And this is your opportunity to take that first step if you want to do it.